All right, we're getting a little deeper into the rules on this one. We are focusing specifically on just movement. There are what I consider 5 different types of movement, and then there's a few specialty types that kind of fall under one of the main 5 categories. First on our list to talk about is walking. Walking is the most common movement type, and pretty much everything has a walking speed unless it's like a beholder and it hovers or it only swims. Walking is pretty basic, but there's a few of these kind of specialty movement types that fall under walking. First of which is crawling. Mechanically, every foot you travel while crawling takes an extra foot of movement. So if you want to crawl 5 feet, it will cost you 10 feet of movement. This functions similar to difficult terrain. Here are the rules for difficult terrain. Every foot of movement in difficult terrain costs an extra foot of movement. Some people mess this up and they say it costs double the amount of movement. I think that comes from here. But the reason this is an important distinction is because if you are hypothetically crawling over this rocky surface that's difficult terrain and you're crawling, each foot of movement will take an extra foot from difficult terrain and an extra foot from crawling, so that would be 3 feet of movement. So if you were to go 5 feet, it would be 15 feet of movement. Some people run it that when it doubles the amount of movement speed it takes to move a foot, that would end up being 20 feet of movement to crawl across 5 feet of difficult terrain. It's not how it works. So the next specialty movement type under walking would be jumping, and specifically long jumping. So the rules for that is if you go at least 10 feet before making your jump, you can jump a distance equal to your strength score. So if you have 20 strength, you can jump 20 feet. If you don't do that 10-foot run beforehand, then you can only jump half that distance. Some important things to note about jumping is that you cannot jump past your movement speed in a turn. So if you have 30 feet of movement and a strength score of 20, if you run 15 feet and then jump, though you can technically still jump 20 feet, your movement speed on that turn will end after 15 feet. So you technically will end your movement in the air. The way I would typically run that is you'll finish your jump at the start of your next turn. The reason I rule it that you finish your jump at the start of your next turn is because hypothetically, they run 15 feet and then jump 20 feet over a 15-foot hole or 20-foot hole. If you stop them at the end of their movement, and it's like your turn ends here and they drop, that would be weird because they can make that jump. If you give your players any boots of striding or springing, because it triples the distance that you could jump. So if you only have 30 feet of movement speed and you have 20 strength, you could jump 60 feet, but you can really only jump 30 feet. The boots specifically say, though you can't jump further than your remaining movement speed would allow. I would still probably allow them to jump that full distance, but just not in one turn. I'm curious how you would rule that. Something else I'm curious how you would rule is it specifically says in an example, you don't give up an attack of opportunity if you're falling past someone or if you're not using your movement. So if you could jump 20 feet, hypothetically, you jump past a bad guy. Do they get an attack of opportunity as you're flying past them? I know how I would rule that, but I'm curious to see in the comments how you would rule that. Do you get an attack of opportunity if you jump past someone? So the only other thing I wanted to call out under the walking section of the movement types is moving through other creatures' spaces. You can move through an ally's space, but it doubles the amount of movement speed that it takes to move through their space if they allow you to, and you cannot end your turn in their space. Similarly, you can only move through an enemy space if they're at least 2 sizes larger than you, and you cannot end your turn in their space. This is also a little bit weird because you can grapple someone, and so I usually put people in the same space if they're grappling. Moving on is swimming is our next type. Certain creatures may have a swimming speed, and if so, they don't have to roll for swimming, and they don't have disadvantage on any attacks while in the water. If you don't have a swimming speed, then you have disadvantage on most weapon attacks, with the exception being like spears, javelins, and some things like that. I think I'll put the list up here of the weapons that you don't have disadvantage on. If you don't have a swimming speed, the creature may or may not know how to swim. If somebody knows how to swim and it's calm water, I would not make them roll an athletics check or anything like that to see if they can swim. But if they've got all their gear on, or they don't know how to swim, or it's rough waters, then you can ask for a check to see if they can swim through it. And the speed functions very similarly to crawling, where every foot you swim takes 2 feet of speed. Very similar with climbing. You don't have to have a climbing speed in order to climb, but the DM may require a check to see if you can climb. This could be athletics or it might be acrobatics. If you do have a climbing speed, you just get to climb. If you don't have a speed, you might have to roll. If the wall looks like this, I would probably let someone just climb it at half speed. If it looks like this, I would require them to make a roll. I also might make them roll if they're trying to do something cool on the wall, like run up the wall really quick. I may allow that based on their roll. Next is burrowing. Unlike the previous movement types, if you don't have a burrowing speed, you cannot burrow. A burrowing creature will leave a tunnel and you could follow them if they're large enough. Probably a bad idea, probably gonna get you killed, especially if it's something like a purple worm. But you do you. They will leave a tunnel that you can follow. The last movement type is flying, and then the sub kind of specialty movement type under that would be hovering. The only main difference between flying or hovering is when you're flying, if your movement speed is reduced to 0, you fall from the sky. You can't fly if you can't move. Whereas with hovering, if you get paralyzed or something and your movement speed drops to 0, you can stay flying. So if there's something like an Aarakocra or an eagle or anything with a flying speed and you hit it with a net and it's restrained, its movement speed drops to 0, it falls from the sky. You hit something like a beholder with a net, they will sit there floating. So when it comes to mixing movement, it's actually pretty easy. It doesn't necessarily make the most sense, but it's very easy to run. What the player's handbook says is whenever you switch between movement speeds, you subtract the total distance you followed from your current movement speed. So hypothetically speaking, you've got 60 feet of movement speed from the fly spell and you've got 30 feet of walking speed. You fly 20 feet, then you land and you walk 10 feet. You've flown 20 out of the 60 feet you have, and you've walked 10 feet, you typically have 30 feet, but because you've traveled a total of 30 feet, you can no longer walk. Your walking speed is reduced to 0. But if you decide to continue flying, you still have 30 more feet of movement. This also means that once you've flown 30 feet, you cannot take a step anymore, even though you have 30 more feet of flying. Like I said, it doesn't completely make sense, but it is the easiest way to run this. The other option would be to get a little more complicated with math, and you could kind of use like division. Like, you know, if I fly 30 feet out of 60, that's half, which means if I land, I have 15 more feet of walking. It's another way you could do it. But I'd probably just stick with the rules as written on this one. It's super simple and I don't think it's ever really gonna matter. Well, that's it. That is everything that you need to know about movement in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Let me know if I missed anything, like the video if you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.